Good morning, everyone. I was just waiting for people to filter through. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Alice Martin, Head of Research at the Work Foundation. Today, MPs are voting on plans to cut health-related benefit spending and roll back a series of benefits that help disabled people live independently and take up work. The reforms were outlined in May's Pathway to Work Green Paper, which simultaneously sets out an ambitious goal to move more people into work and reach an 80% employment rate. But at the same time, they are discussing these potential reforms to benefits today. And all of this is targeted at a sort of broader agenda to keep Britain working, with a review led by Sir Charlie Mayfield. A big part of that is a focus on closing the disability employment gap. There is a real tension between these policy ambitions, and I'm sure some of that will be drawn out in our discussion today. We will be talking about an important and often overlooked part of this debate, which is remote and hybrid work. Since the pandemic, we've seen a huge shift. Today, around 1 in 5 workers work mainly from home. Compare that to 2019, when it was just 1 in 20. For many disabled workers, this has been truly transformative, offering long-needed flexibility and opening doors that were previously closed. But these gains sometimes feel precarious, especially in the context of frequent media headlines about employer mandates to return to the office. Nearly 1 in 4 working-age adults in the UK are disabled. Earlier this year, a Department for Work and Pensions report suggested that a quarter of people currently out of work and claiming health and disability benefits might be able to go to work if they could do so from home. And this raises crucial questions. Are there enough remote and hybrid roles available? What are disabled workers' actual experiences in these jobs? How are employers designing the roles? And how can we make sure these opportunities are accessible to even more people? Today, we're excited to be sharing findings from the largest mixed methods study of its kind, supported by the Nuffield Foundation and led by Dr. Paula Holland at Lancaster University in partnership with a project team. The research uncovers just how essential remote and hybrid work has been for disabled people, how employers have approached it, and what we can do to ensure these options remain inclusive and available. So in a minute, we will dive in. First, we'll be hearing from Paula Holland with a presentation, and then we will invite in 2 panels of brilliant speakers to discuss the findings. Please do use the chat or Q&A function to capture any questions, and we'll come back to these in the panel elements of the meeting. Today, we also have British Sign Language interpreters, Najal and Sally, on the call. So if you would like to view their interpretation, you can spotlight that on your settings. We've got automatic captions enabled as well. So if you would like to view these, please press CC on the black bar at the bottom of your screen. We have asked all speakers to mute themselves when not speaking to make the audio as clear as possible. If you have any questions, you can contact the Work Foundation team via the chat. Over to you, Paula. I'd like to invite you in for your presentation.
Thanks, Alice. John's going to be moving the slides forward for me, which is a great assistance. Thank you. So I'd like to start, first of all, by thanking the Nuffield Foundation for funding this important study, and my super colleagues without whom this study would have not been possible at all. So thank you. Come to the next slide, please. This shouldn't be a surprise. Disabled people in the UK have significantly lower employment rates than those of non-disabled people. The disability employment gap stands at 27.5 percentage points and is partly driven by workplace inflexibility and lack of reasonable adjustments, which undermine disabled people's ability to work. Working from home is a reasonable adjustment, and yet before the pandemic, many employers were reluctant to allow it. Most studies on remote and hybrid have focused on the broader workforce, and relatively little research has explored disabled people's experiences. Next, please. Our forthcoming research shows that while fully remote job listings peaked in the pandemic, they've since declined, although they do remain at higher levels than before the pandemic. Hybrid opportunities have risen sharply, but have recently plateaued. We've also found regional inequalities in remote and hybrid job vacancies across the UK. This slide shows that the highest rates are observed in London and South East England, but the lower availability of hybrid jobs in regions like Wales, North East England and Northern Ireland pose a major employment barrier for disabled workers looking for desk-based jobs in those areas. Next, please. So the aim of our research was to identify ways to make remote and hybrid working more inclusive for disabled workers, to promote their employment, health and well-being. And to do this, we conducted fieldwork with multiple stakeholders. We conducted a UK-wide survey of over 1,200 disabled remote or hybrid workers, interviewing 45 of them in depth. We explored their current and preferred working pattern, their access to reasonable adjustments, how they perceived their remote or hybrid working pattern had affected their mental and physical health, their work-life balance, management of their impairments or health conditions, and their parenting or caring responsibilities, productivity, and other aspects of work life. Our survey sample represents a broad range of health conditions or impairments, including people who are deaf, blind, neurodivergent, people with long COVID, mental ill health, and long-term health conditions. We also conducted 45 interviews with managers or company owners from 27 organisations, exploring how they're implementing remote and hybrid and the benefits and challenges to the organisation. Next, the Access to Work service. The Access to Work service is an important resource for many disabled workers. Sir Stephen Timms, Minister for Social Security and Disability, recently questioned its sustainability, which does suggest forthcoming cuts to the service. We explored the implications of this with 148 members of the Access to Work Collective, which was recently set up by Shani Danda and Jacqueline Winstanley, to bring together disabled people, employers and other stakeholders to raise awareness of the scheme and address the challenges it faces. And then lastly, we conducted a series of small group meetings with senior civil servants and policy leads at the Department for Work and Pensions, the Department for Business and Trade, the UK Women's and Equalities Committee, the Welsh Synod and the English Combined Authorities, exploring their thoughts on whether remote and hybrid working will help reduce the disability employment gap. Today, we can only give you a brief snapshot of all of these findings, but we will be launching our full report later in the month. Next slide, please. So our survey revealed that 40% of our disabled participants were currently working all the time and the rest were hybrid, but 46% wanted to work remotely all of the time. And women, carers, people with multiple or severely limiting impairments or conditions were most likely to report this, and the rest wanted a hybrid pattern. Next, please. But importantly, 85% said that access to remote or hybrid working would be essential or very important if they were looking for a new job. And 79% said they would not apply for a job if remote options were not available. And people with long COVID or problems with stamina, mobility, pain, and sensory processing were most likely to say this. So these findings highlight the importance of increasing the supply of remote and hybrid jobs to achieve the government's aim of helping more disabled people into work. Next slide, please. 43% of our sample were not working their preferred work pattern. Of these, 31% wanted to work remotely more than they currently do. And some of the interviewees explained this, that they were working in organisations where office working was mandatory part of the week or part of the month. And 12% wanted to work remotely less than they do. And some were prevented from working on site due to mobility or health problems, but also transport and workplace inaccessibility. Next, please. And importantly, we found that wanting to work remotely more often than was possible was associated with having significantly poorer mental well-being. Because this is a cross-sectional survey, we don't know if wanting to work at home more leads to poor well-being or whether poor well-being leads to wanting to be working at home more. But we found evidence of both pathways in our interviews. But what these findings do illustrate is the importance of consulting desk-based workers about their preferred work pattern. Next slide. Most participants reported that remote or hybrid working was positive for a range of health and work outcomes. Importantly, the amount of time spent working at home mattered. We found those spending more of their time working at home reported more positive impacts, while negative impacts were more reported by people working at home less often. For example, this slide shows that 64% of fully remote workers said their work pattern positively affected their physical health, compared to only 31% of those working remotely less than half the time. And only 15% of fully remote workers said their work pattern negatively affected their physical health, compared with 42% working at home less than half of their time. Next, please. Likewise, we found 80% of fully remote workers reported their work pattern had a positive impact on their ability to manage their impairments or health conditions, compared with only 38% of workers working at home less than half the time. And again, the likelihood of a negative impact increased as time spent working from home decreased. Next, please. We found a similar pattern for several other outcomes, including the impact on mental health, task completion, productivity, work-life balance, and managing parenting and caring responsibilities. Next, please. Looking at one of our subgroups that we explored, so public narratives have frequently raised the concern that working from home may have a negative impact on young people's employment. This is why it's important to take a nuanced approach, because in our survey, disabled young people reported strong preferences for remote working, and they were significantly more likely than older workers to report their remote and hybrid working positively affected their productivity, career progression, job security, participation in training and teamwork, and they were more likely than older workers to report high job satisfaction and to receive better support from colleagues and managers. Next, please. So why was remote working so important for participants' work and health? Most of our interviewees had worked or still worked in noisy open plan offices where they found it hard to hear and to concentrate. People with sensory sensitivities referred to the importance of being able to control the heating and lighting at home. Exercising was easier at home, which helped with mobility. And people with bowel and bladder difficulties felt less anxious as they had easy access to a toilet. The ability to rest or nap to alleviate pain and fatigue was frequently reported. And this was all positive for people's energy, pain, mobility, productivity. And several said they'd had less sick leave since they started working remote or hybrid working. Some organisations have pushed back on remote working because they're concerned about staff being less productive at home. But 69% of our participants said they were most productive at home, and only 5% were more productive in the office. And people who were neurodivergent or had pain or long COVID were more likely to report being most productive at home. Next slide. Now we're going to hear from some of our participants who took part in our film. This is just a very short clip. We've got a longer film that we're going to release, but this is just a very short clip now. Thank you. There's no sound, I can't hear that. There's no sound, unfortunately. I don't know why, what's happening there.
Apologies, everyone, for the lack of sound. We will try again. I think there are captions there, so we can read along for now. But I believe colleagues are looking at getting a version up with the sound as well.
It was going so well in rehearsal.
Hi, Paula. You could, if you like, carry on with the presentation, and then we could look at if we can bring in both the clips together with sound a bit later on.
Okay. So what those participants were saying basically is the positive aspect of remote and hybrid working for themselves in terms of pacing themselves and so on. But there are challenges too. So hybrid workers who had mandated office days, so they had to go to work some part of the week, were very frustrated when they spent energy commuting, only to end up participating in remote meetings that could have been done from home. And hybrid meetings were often problematic. Some participants lacked accessible technology, and poor chairing could lead to remote attendees being overlooked or not given time to speak. Like other studies, we found some participants reported feeling isolated, but in our survey, isolation was more frequently reported by hybrid workers, not remote workers. Some of our interviewees shed light on this, describing how hot desking systems meant they couldn't sit near colleagues, or their colleagues weren't in the office on the same days as them. Hot desking was reported to be inappropriate for workers with reasonable adjustments in place and for workers needing certainty about their work location. We also found the benefits of remote and hybrid working weren't shared by all. For example, workers with multiple impairments or health conditions and workers from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds were more likely to report challenges with job security and career progression and to need but lack reasonable adjustments. Next slide. In fact, only 47% of our sample had their adjustments fully implemented, putting them at risk of illness and injury. Only 28% of participants had used access to work for support with reasonable adjustments for remote and hybrid. They valued the service but reported long delays with the processing of their application. And those using access to work funding to get to work by taxi reported having to pay for the taxi fares up front and then claim back. And this financial penalty meant some worked on site less than they wished to. Members of the Access to Work Collective confirms that applications and renewals are taking much longer now. Some applicants have had their awards cut at the renewal stage, and new applications are receiving lower levels of benefit than recommended by the assessors. Members reported these difficulties negatively affect applicants' health and ability to work, and there were concerns that cuts to the service would actually reverse the growth of remote and hybrid working. Next slide. Apologies, Callum, I edited it and his eyes are shut. Moving on to employers' perspectives, this is Callum Carson, who conducted our interviews with 45 managers and business owners. And if the sound allows us, we're going to hear from two of our employers. The first adopted a fully remote model since the pandemic, and the second has introduced hybrid working.
Hi, I'm Dr. Callum Carson, a Senior Research Associate on the Inclusive Remote and Hybrid Working Study. Beyond speaking to workers, we also spoke to a number of employers about what they were doing to help support their employees to work in a remote or a hybrid way.
By working remote and accepting that people are going to be remotely working, you actually have a greater spread with regards to looking for people who you can bring into the team.
Candidates for jobs were consistently asking about our approach to hybrid working when they were interested in roles. This was even before they asked about basic things like salary and pension. It was so clear that hybrid working and flexibility was at the top of their agenda, and we clearly could see that it needed to be at the top of ours too, to attract the best talent.
Thank you. Next slide. Employers had adopted remote and hybrid due to concerns for team cohesion, office space not being fully used, and to boost retention and recruitment. But they also recognised the benefits for disabled staff, and some used it to support staff returning from sick leave, and they found the flexibility of remote and hybrid helped promote an inclusive workplace culture. Like our disabled participants, employers reported that remote and hybrid had led to improved well-being, better work-life balance, reduced sick leave, and improved, or at least not declining, productivity. And it was encouraging that in our employer interviews and case studies, we found examples of inclusive practice, such as allowing flexibility of a work location, ensuring reasonable adjustments were implemented both at home and on site for hybrid workers, and giving disabled workers designated desks in hot desking systems. Next slide. Next slide. Thanks. Thank you. However, we also found examples of where there was a disconnection between organisational policy and practice, and this made life difficult for disabled staff. These included managers not understanding their duties under the Equality Act, or putting pressure on staff to work in the office when the organisation had given them a reasonable adjustment to work from home. And because managers vary in their understanding of disability and how to support disabled staff, there was recognition of the precarity disabled staff face when they're given a new manager. Next slide. And this is my final slide before I hand back to Alice. So recommendations for employers. The disabled workers in our sample reported a strong preference for remote or hybrid working and benefits to their health, well-being and employment. So it's important that employers help increase the availability of remote and hybrid working by advertising new desk-based roles as remote or hybrid whenever possible. 43 of our disabled participants wanted to work at home more or less than they currently were, so it's critical employers consult their disabled staff on their preferred work location. 53% lacked the reasonable adjustments they'd asked for. This can undermine the positive impacts of remote and hybrid working, so it's essential employers fully implement reasonable adjustments wherever work takes place. We found the positive impacts of remote and hybrid working on disabled workers' health, well-being and working life declined with the amount of time spent working from home. So we recommend that disabled workers are exempted from mandated office days and have flexibility over their work location. And it's absolutely essential organisations invest in proper accessible technology to improve communication between on-site and remote workers, and that managers are trained to support remote and hybrid staff. Alice in a minute is going to be talking about the findings from meetings with policymakers and also our policy recommendations, but I'll hand back to Alice for now.
Thank you very much, Paula, and thank you everyone for bearing with us with some of our technical issues there. It wouldn't be a remote and hybrid working meeting without some kind of tech issues, but I think we got the findings across there, so thank you very much, Paula. So I would like to bring our panelists in now to discuss these insights. We're going to be focusing on the experiences of disabled workers and considerations for employers. And then in the latter part of the meeting, we're going to tackle some of those policy and government questions as well. So I'd like to introduce Jacqueline Winstanley, founder and CEO of Universal Inclusion and the Inclusive Entrepreneur, and part of the study team. We also have Beth Coombe-Holland, a disability rights specialist and CEO of Patchwork Hub, and Carolyn Mallon from the Chartered Management Institute. And I'm going to invite you all in to turn your cameras on. Brilliant, I can see you all now. So we're going to be discussing this issue of adjusting to a new normal. What have the experiences of inclusive remote and hybrid working been for disabled people and employers? Beth, I think I'll come to you first, if that's okay. It would be really good to hear some of your initial reflections on the findings and anything relevant to the context of the work you've been doing in advocating for the rights of disabled workers over the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So yeah, just to briefly introduce myself, because the background, I guess, is quite relevant for what we're talking about. So I run Patchwork Hub, which is a disabled-led employment platform and consultancy where we support job seekers who are looking for accessible work to connect with opportunities with like-minded inclusive employers. And then we work with those employers to help their approaches around accessibility and disability inclusion. And I think it's fair to say that my whole career is premised on the flexibility provided by remote work. So from a personal perspective, I've had to step away from so many opportunities that I've loved due to barriers in the conventional ways of working. And as someone with a lot of fluctuating chronic and energy limiting conditions, in-person working can be a big blocker. And certainly remote working is really fundamental to our sort of way of working at Patchwork Hub and what we advocate for. So it not only allows, I guess, for us, we're 100% disabled and neurodivergent team set up, and it allows us to have an effective geographic spread across the UK that just wouldn't be possible with in-person working. So I think that's really important to think about from a sort of SME perspective. But alongside that sort of experience of running the business, I think from the actual work and the advocacy work and the work we do with employers, I meet so many incredibly talented people every day who are held back because there just aren't enough remote and hybrid opportunities. And I think what Paula captured and what the study started to look at, the sort of the worries that we all see around the shift back to in-person work and the sort of frustration at the feeling of backward movement and momentum since the pandemic is a sort of constant refrain in my conversations with job seekers. And many employers that I speak to have a lot of assumptions around what working remotely looks like and what it means in terms of team performance that need to be challenged. I think especially for remote workers where we know that productivity levels are higher and there are lower rates of absenteeism for remote disabled workers. So it's really important that that is sort of captured in any of the sort of adjustment discussions as well. So yeah, I've really enjoyed sort of seeing this research develop and the support of the study. I'm delighted to be here today, and yeah, looking forward to hearing from everyone and discussing it all.
Thanks very much, Beth. Jacqueline, could I hand to you, because as you've been a really key part of the project team and the study, and I know you have particular reflections on how some of this impacts self-employed workers and also on the role of access to work and other interventions in the kind of employment setting that support more people into work.
Thank you, Alice. And again, a very, very brief introduction. So I am founder CEO of Universal Inclusion. I'm also a little bit of an academic geek because I do believe it's important to bring together policy, practice and academia whenever you're looking at something like this. And I have experience of, through the various networks and my policy work, looking at the workplace retention, access to, and importantly, through the network that I developed, and Beth has been a key part of, actually the move towards creating innovation and enterprise as a real alternative to being in the employed space. What I'd like to say really, and it's been a privilege to be involved in the study, and I'd like to perhaps outline why this study is so credible and why it's so important. So from concept to the point that it's going to be published, it was co-designed with disabled people, which makes it's really important. It's had incredible engagement. It's not considered to be, it's not an area in academia that people sort of rush towards, but we've had such a fantastic level of engagement to this, which makes the results and the recommendations all the more important. In terms of how we're going to look at this, and I will touch very briefly on the employed aspect of this, and from some personal perspective as well. This COVID was an absolute life changer for disabled people in terms of how suddenly, and people will describe the fact that as we're all today, for those of us that can see the screen, suddenly there was no perception because we were all literally perceived in this one way in this little box. So the participation and opportunity from being at home and being in the workplace through being at home for disabled people, whilst it wasn't increasing that number of people, perhaps to the extent we'd like to see, it did make a huge difference. For the first time, people were talking about, and this is reflected in the study, not having to do that sometimes awful travelling into the workplace, because sadly, for a lot of disabled people who are going into a workplace, by the time they've done that, particularly if they have a fluctuating or energy limiting condition, they're exhausted. And really, to be at their best, the ability to work home hybrid changed that for people. And what we were already seeing pre-COVID was a move away from the employed arena, where people were finding it so challenging. And, not necessarily because employers don't want to do it. And I work a lot with organisations when employers are onboarded, etc., and putting in change frameworks to make the organisation more inclusive. And generally, people want to do it. They just don't know how to do it. There's lots of programs, but it doesn't actually give them the guidance and the experience of lived experience that they're going to need to take on board to do this. So what we saw in respect of a huge shift. So at the moment, last stats showed that 14% of working age disabled people were moving into creating innovation and enterprise within their own businesses. And that's a huge amount. And that also speaks to some of what we are here today on perhaps this historic day with the vote that's going through Parliament today. What it shows that the number of disabled people that are working, this is not an issue of disabled people not wanting to work or not actually being in work. It's how they can be in work and navigate what they have to encounter on a daily basis as symptoms, etc., might present themselves to them. So that's really important. And what's made that possible for people? We've seen that in the findings and the recommendations. And we echo that, because what people tell us time and time again, certainly in terms of self-employment, is that it allows people to work in ways that they're able to, at times that they're able to do, and achieve the wonderful things that they're able to do with that. I'll add a caveat to that. So myself and many disabled people have, for the past, probably since 1994, benefited from the Access to Work Award. A study that we were recently involved in, the Road to Wonder study that looked at self-employment, highlighted a correlation between a disabled person receiving an Access to Work Award and then being able to go on and create a business, innovation and enterprise within that. That's crucial. Now, sadly, what we're starting to see, and it is within the bill that's going forward today, it's not being as covered as highly as the PIP and the universal credit, but it is within there to put forward proposals to actually make it harder to get it. What we're seeing within the work before we started the Access to Work Collective was, as we stated earlier in some of your findings in the report, a definite shift, and perhaps starting to see the Access to Work Award not as what it is, because the Access to Work Award is not a benefit. It's a discretionary award, and it's meant to put in place what would be considered to be not reasonable for an employer or a self-employed person to be able to afford to do themselves. What we're starting to see, sadly, is some shifts, not only in the actual function, the purpose of Access to Work, and a move to look perhaps more closely as seeing this as a welfare response, which again, we think is rather short-sighted, because rather than seeing the absolute wonderful things that can come from this, that grow the economy, but more importantly, that even though there is a consultation process going forward at the moment, the cuts that are being put into place for Access to Work are happening now. So people that have, whether it would be in an employed arena or a self-employed arena, a real concern about what's going to happen with Access to Work, particularly when we see reductions of 40 to 60% in people's wards, and in some cases, a removal of the reward altogether. That in the current climate of the perhaps misinterpretation to get disabled people back into work based on the principle that they don't want to, not a reflection of the percentage of people that are creating innovation enterprise, the percentage of people that are working, that are supported through Access to Work, and in order to continue to do the home hybrid working, they're going to need to continue to get a substantive Access to Work award. So from our perspective, incredible report. Findings are absolutely an accurate reflection of the lived experience of disabled people, and that's why I think it's really important. There are some issues that need addressing very quickly, because otherwise all of this good work and this place that, you know, and I include myself in this, where disabled people have found a space that they can be supported through Access to work in a home hybrid way, work to the best of our potential, navigating our health conditions. Some of the things that are on the table today that government are proposing, we fear are going to set that back years, and that's really important. So
Thank you very much.
that's my thoughts at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And thank you for drawing attention to the fact that Access to Work is potentially being retrenched under the changes today, because it hasn't received as much attention as you say, and lots of the questions in the Q&A function are drawing attention to the fact that even in its current form it isn't working well, either to do with waiting times or to do with people not being given the type of award that they really need. So I think you've actually answered quite a few of the questions there that were coming up, so that was really brilliant. Thank you. Just to say, there have been some questions about the chat function. So I think the chat function isn't open, but the Q&A is open. So you should all be able to ask questions there and respond to one another's questions as well. There are a few questions about whether we'll be sharing the materials. Yes, we will. We will share the slides and the recording, and the full report will be published soon as well. We have an interim report which we can link to on our website as well. So you will all have the material. I would like to bring in Caroline at this point, if I may, just to discuss some of the questions that are being raised about the role of employers, and perhaps some of the challenges employers and managers face in knowing how to introduce remote and hybrid work in an inclusive way, and any reflections that you have, Caroline, on the broader findings. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, Alice, and thanks, Paula. Music to my ears that the last of your recommendations was train your managers. It's no surprise I would say that from the Chartered Management Institute. By way of background, we are the professional body for managers and leaders across the UK. We offer the highest award in skilled management in Chartered, and we have 220,000 practicing managers as members. So our perspective on this, and what I found quite, as by way of reflection, so much of the findings are not specific to people with disabilities. So much of the findings on I am more productive when I can concentrate, I am more productive when I'm not trekking to an office to be on remote calls all day. Those are universal truths that we find in our regular research with managers working across the UK economy. What we also find, to the training point, is 3/5 of managers have never had any training in how to help a person back into work who has been off with long-term illness or with a disability. There's a starter of where we can do things better, is where we can offer people education in what reasonable adjustments mean, and also understanding the importance of inclusion in, if you are running a hybrid organization, that the people on calls are as included in the conversation, that side conversations that happen in an office are shared with people who might not be there that day. Again, these are universal truths, regardless of whether you are working remotely for other reasons or whether you're working remotely to accommodate a health concern or a disability. I know we've got questions, so I will stop there, Alice, and go back to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, so, and you've touched on some of the questions I think that are coming in as well. There was one asking, to what extent are these findings specific to disabled workers, or are these, shared experiences of remote and hybrid, being a positive, kind of productive way of working for all workers? And I think that's a good point, because I think one of the messages really from the findings is that if we are to design work from the perspective of disabled workers, actually that would benefit everyone as well. But I would like to put that to colleagues on the panel, if there are any, or even yourself, Paula, if there were specific findings that you think respond directly to the experiences of disabled workers, or whether you think all of these benefits can be shared by everyone. And perhaps just to add on a kind of secondary question to that, to try and bring in some of the other perspectives. There have been questions around the extent to which the vacancies available are suitable for disabled workers in terms of being on a part-time or full-time basis, and the way that jobs are designed sort of beyond the work location as well. And I think one of the findings that's out there and talked about frequently is that remote and hybrid jobs are often accessible only for people with degrees or with professional level qualifications, meaning a whole load of people will be missing out on these opportunities altogether. So if anyone would like to come in on either of those topics, please do raise your hand. I can see, Paula, you've unmuted, so I will bring you in.
I'll do the first one first before it slips from my mind. It's a really good question. So I think all knowledge-based, desk-based workers, I think, well, not all, but overwhelmingly, there's the pandemic studies. Once the initial lockdown happened and everyone got used to it, all the studies that were conducted on remote and hybrid working on the general workforce showed overwhelmingly positive impacts on kind of productivity and all the other outcomes that we've looked at. And in our survey of disabled people and in the interviews, people were saying things, advantages that didn't relate to being disabled. Okay, so picking the kids up from school, walking the dog, walking around the lake at lunchtime rather than just sitting in my office or walking around the car park at work. So there are going to be general things that greater availability of remote and hybrid is going to benefit possibly all desk-based workers that want to do it. That's the key thing. But the stories, the survey and the interviews that Callum conducted, with disabled people, were mostly talking about, as a disabled person, I find remote working easier for these reasons. And the slide where I talked about that, the home as being more suitable for working, it was basically shaming the office, right? The office is too this, it's too that, it's too hot, it's too noisy. People keep swinging by my desk and having a chat, and I can't stand that kind of interruptions. I can't get back to my work. And so yes, I think it's going to benefit all desk-based workers, but particularly disabled people. And of course, we know, going back to the very first slide, we've got this huge disability employment gap, so they have to be our priority.
Thanks very much, Paula. And Beth, if I could put the second part of the question to you, which is around, are there particular groups of workers who are locked out of these forms of work, and how can we really design jobs in a way to enable more people to access remote and hybrid?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to pick up on Paula's last point, I think it's also the demographics of individuals across the sectors and geographies point as well. So it's not just it's for non-disabled people, it's also across allowing your point around the sort of education levels for job vacancies and stuff for remote and hybrid workers is something that I think is a really important point that doesn't get mentioned that much around the sort of real inequalities outside of London and the southeast when it comes to remote and hybrid work. There's some decent regional level work at the combined authority levels that are doing bits in this fund, but I think that sort of sectoral approach is sort of useful in driving the creative thinking in sectors where an existence that flexible work just isn't necessarily possible for the in-person side. And I think on the sort of vacancy side, I guess running a inclusive jobs board, it's something that we see a lot in terms of the, I guess, lack of remote or hybrid roles at the moment, especially, and lack of clarity as well around the possibility of those being remote or hybrid as adjustments for the role. And I think that is something that is an important point that we need to pick up, and I think it's been mentioned in the Q&A a few times as well, of how at the moment we're forgetting the sort of reasonable adjustment aspect of remote working. And it's something that we see and I hear a lot from job seekers. They'd love to work, but it's just having that flexibility of being remote. And it's why as Jacqueline was saying, in terms of the self-employment point, a disproportionate number of people turn to that because there aren't those vacancies at the moment. And I think for us, like with Patchwork Hub, finding jobs that are fully remote or even now advertised as hybrid are like gold dust, because we know so many of those users need those adjustments. But as the study shows, there's far too often across job adverts, it's really unclear what's possible for a given role. If we were to enforce, we sort of had to change our policy at Patchwork Hub over the last couple of years. Because if we were to enforce solely jobs that had clear and explicit scope for remote work, we'd have almost no jobs on our jobs board. It's as simple as that. So I think that sort of shows the state of where the sort of sectors are currently at. And we work across sectors, and it's a point that comes up across all of them, really.
Thank you. That's really helpful, those reflections there, particularly in relation to that advertising gap that we're seeing as well. That's something that we found in our review of the Department for Work and Pensions jobs board as well, where we found a tiny number of roles being advertised as it was remote and hybrid, which was a clear barrier to people who knew they would need these models once they joined the organisation, but also then it creates ambiguity around what types of reasonable adjustments may be on offer. And I know that that's what a lot of the questions are relating to in the chat. Paula, I saw you wanted to come back in. Do you want to also pick up on any of those points about reasonable adjustments as well?
I was just going to, so Beth's really good point about job adverts. They look at remote and they drill into the detail, or you've got to be in the office once a week in London or something. What came up in the interviews, and I didn't have time to talk about in our presentation, was the difficulty of mandated office days, which relates to what Beth was saying about job vacancies. And there was a lot of anxiety amongst our disabled people about mandated office days and being told to come in more often than they had to be, unless they had it as a reasonable adjustment and they felt quite confident then that they were safe. But none of the disabled people we interviewed had been told by their organisation that they hadn't been shown any evidence that mandated office days were necessary, which goes back to the point about vacancies. Are they necessary? And if they are necessary, then organisations really need to be transparent about the business need for mandated office days, because they have such a consequence for disabled workers who really need that flexibility and ability to work from home. And people were putting such pressure on themselves to attend their mandated office days at massive cost, and it had a cost of, I'll go into the office on Monday, but then I'm going to be knackered Tuesday, Wednesday, and it's going to have a cost on my productivity and so on. So yeah, really making the evidence base clear, if there is one, that mandated office days are needed. And actually, like I presented, there wasn't, people were saying in the study, particularly young workers, that working from home isn't a barrier to teamwork and social interaction. You know, it's on the contrary. I don't know what the question was about reasonable adjustments, because I was thinking about that point, Beth. Alice.
No problem. I mean, there have been a few questions in the Q&A, so perhaps other panelists, if you feel able to answer any of them and you want to type directly in there, then please do go ahead. I can see, Jacqueline, you want to come back in, and I was just going to raise one of the questions that's come up as well, which is around the return to office mandates, and we've just started touching on this now. I was interested to hear panelists' thoughts on whether the return to office mandates from employers that are hitting the headlines are more bark than bite. Do we think that these really reflect a changing sentiment in the world of work, or are these just ways to grab headlines? If I may, Caroline, just bring you in on that point, and then Jacqueline, I'll bring you in on those broader points afterwards.
Thank you. Yes, I do think it is a real thing. I think it's a real thing that's being very badly managed by several large employers, mandating it, and then, oh, surprise, surprise, there are not enough desks or office space. And I think part of this all comes back to, regardless of the workers' needs or requirements, there is a basic trust element. Good managers train their people, develop their people, and then trust them to do their jobs. So when that trust element is not there, then you get, I need to see you to believe you type of mandate. So it goes to my mind, to the sort of wider conversation about the culture of an organization. You know, we did a report called Walking the Walk, not surprisingly, about tick box exercises around inclusion policies versus the companies that view inclusion as business critical. And surprise, surprise, they have better business outcomes, and their entire culture is born of trusting their employees. So sadly, I do think it is a thing. We have asked our managers about it, and time again, flexibility trumps pay, trumps benefits, trumps pension. It comes above everything else because it's what the workforce, where possible, wants. And I think if those voices join with communities that need reasonable adjustments and need to be remote for other reasons, I think that it's a much more powerful and an argument that will land with government, that this is not about a specific part of your workforce, although a part that should be better represented in the workforce. It is very much about working people in the United Kingdom and what they want today out of their employers. And it is a pact with our employers that if you treat us well and trust us, we deliver better for you. And that's not notional, that's actually backed up by all of the evidence.
Thanks, that was really convincing points there, Caroline, well made. And I think to some extent, these questions of trust relate to some of the questions coming in with regards to reasonable adjustments. And there are people asking questions around, should there be clearer kind of timetabling for these changes and stronger enforcement as well? Or is it more that we need a kind of rethink of the legislation itself and maybe approach some of these questions in a different way? Jacqueline, could I bring you in on that point, or the earlier point that you were keen to make?
I think I'll come in on that point if that's okay. Thank you. Gosh, on today of all days as well. I'd like to make an observation, and that observation stems around how, as a society and as a government, work is viewed, and the purpose of work and why people go to work and what we hope as a society to achieve by that. Now, at the moment, in terms of reasonable adjustments, there's a push for a really, so definitely a scheme that is broken, but a scheme that, if it was working very well, would allow people to have the reasonable adjustments that they need to be in work and to be in good work, whether that be employed or self-employed. What we're starting to see is a push from government to actually put the cost of those reasonable adjustments onto the employer. And that's one of the things that's included in the bill that's being put forward today. Now, in doing that, what I think underpins that, sadly, is not just our government, but successive governments have looked at this issue as disabled people work equals welfare, rather than disabled people, the right to have good work and a good life, good socioeconomic status, nothing to do with welfare, nothing at all to do with welfare, and measuring people as to whether they deserve to have it, could they have it, how long it's going to take for them to get it, because sadly at the moment, even if somebody who's working remote and hybrid, if they are fortunate enough to get a reasonable adjustment that involves any level of support work, equipment, etc., it can sometimes take almost 6 months from being into that new role, whatever. Equally, if somebody might have a reasonable adjustment in place for some assistive technology, it can then take longer because there are actual, particularly larger companies, for them to actually incorporate the assistive technology, it doesn't gel. It's not compatible. So again, there's lots of different reasons around reasonable adjustments that can be, we will say game changing when it's in place, it's appropriate, it's not done on a welfare budget saving exercise, it's really done on an individual basis on what that individual needs to be able to do that job, employed, self-employed, and to have those things in place so that as individual citizens, and we're talking about disabled people today, but I would offer that broadly, individual citizens to be able to work in the way that they can work in the most positive way to achieve what they want to achieve, and if that, if that's for themselves or part of a broader organisation, what the organisation needs as well.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I think that's a really brilliant note, actually, Jacqueline, because I think a lot of this does come back to that point around autonomy and consultation with workers as well, and actually going to workforces to look at the appropriate ways to design work and design jobs. So that's a really good point, I think, to transition us through to the next part of our discussion. And there were some great pointers there as well in relation to the proposed welfare cuts. And so we are going to be focusing now in this second part on the political agenda and on some of the changes proposed by government and how this relates to the findings. So I believe we're going to have another chance as well to listen to the first video, which we couldn't get the sound for earlier on. So we will give that another try.
Interviews with some of our survey participants revealed why working remotely was positive for their work and health.
For me, remote working has been an absolute lifesaver.
Really like how easy it is to pace myself. So if I need to get a drink or take a break or lay down on the floor for 5 minutes, I can do that, and it's a lot easier to do at home than it is in the office.
So much easier than if I had to go through all the effort of getting dressed, driving to the meeting, being at the meeting, and then driving home. It just cuts all that exhausting work out, and I can focus just on the meeting.
I'm on the autistic spectrum, and dealing with the office environment on a day-to-day basis is incredibly challenging. And remote working has just taken all the difficulties away.
Interviews.
Okay, I'm glad we got to hear that. So now, to frame the next part of the discussion, we're going to be raising two key policy changes on the agenda. First, the cuts to welfare for disabled people, which are being voted on today. If we move on to the next slide, it covers some recent analysis by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. That's one, great. And we're very pleased to have fed into this study with our study findings as well. And it demonstrates by one measure that there really aren't enough jobs available for the numbers of disabled people who are likely to lose their benefits under the proposed reforms. So the chart is showing that for every one job advertised, as disability confident across the UK. And we know, let's bracket off there, that we know disability confidence as a metric of whether a job is actually accessible for disabled people is under question, and we'll discuss some of that. But as a useful metric, for every one job advertised as disability confident across the UK, there are 100 people currently in receipt of the universal credit health element. So I think this is one way of showing the mismatch between the high numbers of people who are out of work due to long-term health conditions and disabilities, and then the lack of appropriate jobs. And this mismatch is more acute in certain areas. So in post-industrial areas, for example, in the north and the Midlands of the country, of England, this is quite an acute mismatch, whereas we know there are more remote and hybrid jobs available in London and the South East. So we think that these findings really chime with some of the findings Paula shared earlier, suggesting that hybrid and remote jobs actually aren't available everywhere, and there aren't enough of them anyway. If we could move to the next slide. The second key bit of context is the Employment Rights Bill making its way through Parliament, which intends to roll out flexible working to more people. But as we've heard already in the meeting, there are mixed messages from employers on how to welcome, or how welcome these changes will be. Our colleague at the Work Foundation, Rebecca Florison, who was part of the study, has given several media interviews on the issue, and she's really tried to insert the important account of disabled workers into the debate, because as we've heard, job opportunities for disabled workers hang in the balance when flexible working comes under fire in these very visible ways. If we move on to the next slide. And so we've been engaging in these debates as much as possible, and we've been talking to colleagues in the Department for Work and Pensions, Department for Business and Trade, and local combined authorities, including Greater Manchester and West Yorkshire. And we have heard about the key policy challenges that they face. So a big one is this mismatch between the narrative and reality on flexible working. So there's an insufficient volume of remote and hybrid roles being advertised. Some workers can't access them. We also have the tension between the Employment Rights Bill and the return to office mandates. We're also hearing that employers aren't complying with the law on reasonable adjustments, which is something that came out in the discussion earlier. Access to work needs strengthening, not retrenching. And the Disability Confidence Scheme needs greater accountability. It lacks independent oversight, which has come up time and time again in our engagement with policymakers about its effectiveness. If we could move to the next slide. So we have tried to raise the study findings in a number of different forums so far, and taking account of this evolving policy context. And there's just some examples of where we've been feeding the findings into various consultations, evidence sessions, and meetings, and we think there will be more to come. And if we move to the final slide, and from all of that engagement, we have made recommendations for government. And I'll highlight a kind of key three areas, and then I think we'll move into a discussion with our panelists to talk about some of this. So first of all, increase the availability of remote and hybrid roles. This includes leading a positive narrative from government around remote working, encouraging employers to offer remote and hybrid options for all desk-based roles, and using the public sector as a major employer to lead from the front on some of this. We're also recommending strengthening enforcement of reasonable adjustments, so providing remote and hybrid working as a reasonable adjustment when requested. That might include some of the timetabling and time limits that we were discussing earlier as well. Requiring large employers to report rates of reasonable adjustment implementation and disclose proportions of staff with access to remote and hybrid work. And we're also recommending to strengthen the access to work service and not retrench it. That includes increasing investment and working with disabled people to improve the service. So I would now like to bring in our final two panelists to discuss these policy challenges and recommendations. I'm really pleased to say that we're joined by Fazile Hadi, Head of Policy at Disability Rights UK, and also Professor Debbie Foster, Professor of Employment Relations and Diversity from Cardiff Business School. I should say as well, we have over 120 people on the call still. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining and being so engaged in this discussion. Fazile, I will come to you first. How do we move past the mixed messages coming from government?
Alice, good afternoon to you and everyone. Could I just check I'm holding my phone in the right place so that you're not looking at my nose or something horrific?
You are, we can see you wonderfully.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So where to start with this government? Obviously, with Disability Rights UK, they're not our favourite government at the moment, which takes some doing, actually, thinking about it. And I think one of the big issues, if we really look at the big picture, is that they don't have a kind of joined up view of how to tackle systemic inequalities and barriers that disabled people face. And I know today's about employment, but I think we have to put this in the wider kind of framing that there are a growing number of disabled people in the population, partly because of demographics, partly because the NHS isn't working properly either for older people who need operations or for younger people who need mental health services, because poverty drives sickness and disability, and we see greater levels in the poorest areas, and because the pension rate for women has gone up. So there's more of us who are older in the workforce. And indeed, I think because of the way the economics are going, there are going to be more people who are older in the workforce over retirement age as well. So I think there just are more disabled people, and the sooner the government gets its head around that and stops just talking about it as a bit of a nightmare for the benefits bill, which is its current kind of focus, the better, because we are a society that has to become more inclusive. And the fact that there's more disabled people signing up for benefits is a symptom. It's not the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is that we are discriminated against and disproportionately poor, disproportionately undereducated, etc., with major barriers, as some people have already mentioned on your panel, in terms of accessible home, accessible transport, access to social care, access to education. So I think the government's focus on welfare benefits is, from our point of view, very much about a spreadsheet calculation about saving money, because from where we're sitting, if the government truly wanted to support disabled people to get on in life and to figure it out when they acquire disabilities later in life, they would be going upstream of where the benefit system is and really looking at what's needed to change in society to help us flourish. So I think that's why the government's messages are so contradictory. So they're not prepared. They've made no statement about the 1.5 million homes being accessible. They've kicked social care into the long grass. They're doing some stuff around employment, around disability and ethnic minority monitoring in the workforce. And their main focus at the moment is cutting the social security bill for working age adults. So it's a very messy picture, and it doesn't give me any confidence that they're really understanding some of the challenges disabled people face.
Thank you very much, Fazile. That raises a number of key points, actually, and I think you've really hit the nail on the head there with this complex and contradictory picture that we're having across different elements of government at the moment. And I've seen people in the Q&A function offering some of the more kind of positive initiatives that are happening in pockets of the country. For example, the West Midlands Combined Authority launching an ambition to make the West Midlands an exemplary region for disabled people. And there are others drawing attention to the Disability Employment Charter and other initiatives. And it feels like whilst are these pockets of great action, as you say, the kind of overall strategy and the long-term thinking doesn't appear to be there from the government. And Debbie, I'd like to bring you in, I think, on that point, and with the question really of how do you think the Employment Rights Bill will land in this sort of mess of a situation that's been created?
Yeah, can I just give a little bit of context from where my background is?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, I'm currently co-chair of a disability rights task force that Welsh Government set up, and I was the nominee of disabled people, and the other chair is a minister within the Welsh Government, Jane Hutt, who's the Minister for Social Justice. And we've been sort of looking at a range of issues because, like a lot of people have said on this call, employment and disabled people is just one aspect of the problem. There's also housing, transport, poverty, social deprivation, wider social deprivation, geography. A number of people have mentioned geography. And in Wales, we have a problem that we have a lot of rural areas, and people are geographically remote. And I noted from the little graph that went up about the availability of remote and hybrid jobs, Wales was really low down. And I think that is possibly because there's probably more hybrid than fully remote jobs. And if you have to go into the office, which is possibly in Cardiff, 1 day a week, and you live out in West Wales, that's going to take you 3 to 4 hours because of the public transport system. So it's not a viable thing to take a hybrid job in an area like that. And you've got other parts of the UK like that, where, in Wales, we've got an M4 corridor. If you live on the M4 corridor, you can get into Cardiff, Swansea, the big cities. If you don't, you're not going to be able to do hybrid work. You're only really going to be able to do remote work because of the transport system. And okay, Welsh Government have recognised transport needs investment in, and they're trying to do something about that. But I think what is being said here is we need a much more holistic view, a social model of disability, rather than the medical model of disability, where we see that disabled people are disabled by multiple barriers in society. My other hat is that I'm an academic, and I did a piece of work that predated this. During the pandemic, I was working with the Law Society and disabled members of the Law Society, and did a survey, one of the few surveys, into remote working during the pandemic. And the reason we did this was because we'd done a big piece of work called Legally Disabled, which was a drill funded project, which was funded by the disability rights movements, including Disability Rights UK. And we'd found that the most requested but refused reasonable adjustment was home working within the legal profession. And of course, during the pandemic, suddenly everything had to move online, and the profession got their act together because there was a profit motive, and suddenly they facilitated hybrid and remote working. And it was declared as utterly liberating, and it had lots of benefits for women and carers within that sector as well. So that's the sort of context that I've come from. In terms of the Employment Rights Bill that's landing as well, I wanted to say something about the availability of flexible working from day one, which is a really positive measure that's going to be put into action if, hopefully from here on, if nothing else goes wrong. But I do think that there is, from the research I've done and the research I did in the legal sector, I found that a lot of employers didn't understand the difference between flexible work for particularly women and flexible work for disabled people. And having the right to request flexible work from day one is great for everybody, but employers still need to understand there is a distinction between flexible work as a reasonable adjustment and flexible work for other reasons, because there is a legal obligation that is there that actually predates any claim to flexible working from day one. as flexible working for a reasonable adjustment. What I found in a lot of big organisations with HR departments, so they didn't really have an excuse, was that they had like a flexible working committee where you applied for your flexible work, you made your application, and there was no differentiation between whether you're a disabled person in need of flexible work as a reasonable adjustment and wanting flexible work for other reasons. Those other reasons are totally valid. I'm not saying that they're less valid, but they need to be treated separately because the basis in law is very different. And it's something that there was a call for evidence from the Office for Equal Opportunities just recently. Something that I've raised with that, I've raised the issue about reasonable adjustments. I think the idea about pay gap reporting has had lots of media attention. But what I've argued in my submission is we first need to get the causes of unequal pay right before we can talk about the ambition of getting an equal pay for disabled people. We need to really tackle those causes, and a lot of those have been mentioned here: lack of flexibility, lack of reasonable adjustments, poor enactment of the current legislation. So I think a lot of things need to be changed that are already within the Equality Act. And I would like to see flexible working, hybrid and home working as an agreed reasonable adjustment in law, rather than have to go through employment tribunals and keep arguing every separate case. Yeah,
I think that's a really useful point to raise, and it's something that I know causes a lot of frustration, the sort of subsuming of the reasonable adjustments law and duty that exists under this sort of broader conversation about flexible work, which is positive, but as you say, could actually lead to confusion about existing rights that do exist but aren't being enforced. And one of the policy areas we explored is whether the proposed mandatory reporting on disability pay gaps that you've talked about, whether that could actually be used as a way to draw more attention to this lack of enforcement on reasonable adjustments. So could there be an expectation for large employers to disclose their rates of reasonable adjustments? And are there other ways that this could be brought in line, maybe with a strengthened disability confidence scheme, which we know isn't working very well, that the sort of accreditation that employers can self-select for if they believe that they're a disability confident employer, and we know from other research it's not working very well. Are there ways to bring together these ideas and these pieces of legislation to actually strengthen the situation that we have? And I saw in the questions as well, there are questions about the Fair Work Agency and the extent to which the government will be able to enforce some of these changes. I don't know whether, Fazila, you have any thoughts on that and the kind of workforce experience of this.
I mean, I'm very supportive, as is Disability Rights UK, of disability workforce monitoring. So the government's consulting on disability pay gap monitoring. But I think that actually we need something a bit broader than just pay. And the reason I say that is because I think what gets measured gets done, and what's visible gets done. And I think there'll be lots of initial issues with disability workforce monitoring, the biggest of which is that disabled people within the workforce aren't that confident to share they've got a disability where they feel they don't need to. And that's a huge cultural issue for employers. But the sooner they begin to tackle that issue, the better, because actually, without people feeling confident to say they are disabled or say they have a reasonable adjustment requirement under the Act, we're just going to carry on being the invisible part of the workforce and leaving it to a handful of people to bring challenges. So I think there's something for me about, if disability workforce monitoring is done properly and employers actually begin to work with their disabled employees and begin to try and change the culture of their organisation and do it in that positive way around how do we get better, how do we need to use the anticipatory duty under the Equality Act to look forward to what will help all disabled and other employees. You know, how can we actually use workforce monitoring to pick up issues that are more general, like does hybrid and remote working help all, or, you know, should we put more in place? So great proponent of that. I think in terms of reasonable adjustments, there's also people campaigning for reasonable adjustments to be made much more enforceable, you know, with more with the employer obligations being stated and having time limits. So I think we've got calls for 2-week time limits, 4-week time limits for responses, because a lot of employees are making requests and they're just going into a black hole, to be honest. They're not even responded to. And I think, you know, the Equality Act is amazing in so many ways, but for most of us as disabled employees, we really don't want to get too adversarial. It kind of spoils the employer-employee relationship. And we need to do some of these things, you know, upstream, so that we don't put it on a disabled employee to have to fight a battle that actually is a bit unwinnable when the employer's got a great deal more power than we have.
Thank you. And I suppose picking up on that point, how do colleagues feel about the disability confidence accreditation? This is the accreditation that invites employers to commit to changes to boost their employment of disabled people. It has been widely criticised for being ineffective and in some cases a distraction, and perhaps employers are using it as a form of sort of social washing their practices and not actually putting into place the necessary changes to employ more disabled people. Can it be improved and redeemed, or do we need to take a different approach of the kind that we've been talking about?
In Wales, we've actually done a piece of research on the Disability Confidence Scheme. This came out of the task force. The task force co-produced everything between policymakers in Wales and Welsh Government and disabled people in their organisations. And one of the big recommendations was to reform disability confident or scrap it. Disabled people just said, this isn't working for us, it's a really poor scheme, it's patronising, it doesn't deliver for either employers or employees. So what we proposed was something that's not been done before. We proposed that government social researchers and disabled people from the Disability Rights Task Force did a piece of research, which is now published on the Welsh Government's website, and it was looking into exploring the ways to improve the Disability Confidence Scheme in Wales. A lot of disabled people in Wales said, well, you know, there's a lot more trust in Welsh Government, so why don't we have our own employers scheme? And we looked at the possibility of doing that and decided that because employers operate across borders, that was going to be quite difficult. But the overriding outcome of the research, which was with employers, trade unions and disabled people's organisations and impairment groups, was that level 1 and 2 of disability confident are just useless. They're not fit for purpose. Level 3 has some merits to it. In Wales, we only had a very small amount of level 3 employers, and we interviewed them and brought them to a focus group, and they discussed that they were committed, but actually the scheme wasn't giving them enough back. They wanted to put more into the scheme, they wanted greater flexibility into this in the scheme, and they had all sorts of ideas of ways that they could enhance the scheme. But I think what we came down to in the end was that this is a scheme run by a government for which there is no accountability to disabled people and their organisations. So there's no reporting back. How many disabled people benefited from you being a level 3, 2 or 1 employer? How many disabled people agree that being a level 1, 2 or 3 employer has enhanced their experience in the workplace? You know, we went through this, and I think a lot of the things that we've discussed at a Welsh level resonate across the UK. that there should be more involvement of disabled people in their organisations, in policy, in co-production. But for that to happen, that is not cheap. Government have to fund these organisations, these community groups or these disabled people's organisations, so that they can meaningfully participate in that policy space. It's no good giving people 1, 2, 3-year contracts and then saying you've worked up this programme that's supported disabled people in your community to get back into work, and then pull the plug on it and ask them to start all over again. And this is how government funding initiatives keep working, on very short-term goals. And I think there needs to be a revolution in the way that we see communities working for the public interest with government and co-producing solutions.
Thanks.
I don't know how somebody from Disability Rights UK will feel about that, but I'm hoping you're going to feel positive.
Yeah, and I think, Debbie, am I right that actually you don't actually have to employ any disabled people to get to level 3? I don't think.
No, you don't.
It's pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, and it feels like a big opportunity there, given the changes that are underway with the pay gap reporting, the Employment Rights Bill, the Fair Work Agency. There's an opportunity that the government could take here to strengthen and reform the measures that do exist already. So in a minute, I'm going to pose a final question to both Fazile and Debbie, and maybe I'll tell you the question now so that you can think about it whilst I read out some of the participant comments as well. So the question is going to be, what is the key government lever needed to roll out inclusive remote and hybrid work at the juncture that we're in? And so we've talked about a number of those levers there, but if there's something that you really want to leave our audience with to think about, that would be brilliant. And I'm just going to read out some of the comments because I think there have been some really useful offerings here. So Mark Fosbrook offers that pay gap reporting is only accurate if people feel psychologically safe to disclose. The reporting is only then useful if businesses then work to reduce the gap. I think we would agree with that. From Joy, I started my Access to Work application a couple of years ago and stopped because I simply didn't know what reasonable adjustments I needed. That might sound daft, but some support by employers to guide the conversation would help, especially when we have been diagnosed or become disabled in later life. And I can see others on the call are offering thoughts and advice and support on that point and validating that point as well. I think there's other comments here suggesting something along the lines of the housing ombudsman could be used to enforce some of the legislation that already exists but isn't working well. So the ability to leverage a small fine for large organisations above a certain threshold so as to not discourage entrepreneurship. And there are thoughts about how to reformulate the disability confidence scheme. Yes, employers who sign up should have to be proactive in progressing to the next level. And there's a lot of agreement there for disabled people being involved in the actual design and monitoring of how these types of schemes would work. So for our final few minutes, I'd like to bring in Fazile first on that question of what are the key government levers to roll out more inclusive remote and hybrid work for disabled people, but for everyone as well.
So I don't know if it's a lever, but I'm going to say that I think the government and Parliament should begin to role model what inclusive working looks like. I was at the Modernisation Committee for the House of Commons last week, and a more excluding environment you could not find, you know, where disabled MPs are struggling to get round the building, struggling to sit on the chairs, struggling to stay in the chamber for many, many hours because they don't know when they're being called, struggling to bob when apparently the speaker tries to catch people's eyes, etc. I mean, you couldn't make it up. And we can add to that the civil service 3-day in the office mandate. I mean, for goodness sake, you know, the government that wants disabled people to get into work, to actually put barriers and make its own work so unnecessarily rigid. And the conversation earlier was rightly about, you know, trusting employees. But I'd also say if you're managing by outcomes rather than bums on seats, it shouldn't be a stretch to employ people who work from home or work in a hybrid way. So I think the government actually walking the walk, living the message would be fantastic. I think the other thing they could do is look at the Equality Act and the guidance that's produced under the Act, and whether they should do something about strengthening the obligations on employers to treat reasonable adjustments seriously, and to give employees some more timescales and a sense that, you know, it is a powerful process rather than something that just gets thrown into the long grass.
Thank you very much, Fazile. So lead from the front, sort out your own practices first, use the government levers of itself as an employer as well to implement some of these changes, and revisit the Equality Act and ensure that it is being well enforced in workplaces. Over to you, Debbie.
Yes, totally agree with all that. Welsh Government are actually, they do implement hybrid and remote working practices really effectively. So why can't we have some really good case studies of organisations that do make this work, make sure that they're circulated, they're available. From an employer perspective, when we did our disability confident research, we had employers tell us that a lot of the time they're just lost for information. And there was actually a suggestion, and I think it's a good suggestion, that there are standardized procedures for, you know, writing up reasonable adjustments, for formalizing that process. I've always argued in my research from the findings that it's very odd that reasonable adjustments that can change the terms and conditions of your core terms and conditions of employment is not treated like a formal employment relations process. There's no right to representation in that process. There's no right to take a trade union representative along with you. And normally you get to the point where if you are a trade union member, the only time you ask your trade union rep to come with you is when there's a really bad dispute. Then it looks like an escalation of conflict because you've asked your union rep to come along. So HR go, oh, there's something going on here. We've escalated everything to having a trade union rep. But, you know, any other sort of realm of looking at your employment contract, if you're going to implement reasonable adjustments, you should be thinking about imaginative job redesign. You should be thinking about job carving. You should be thinking about not fitting the disabled person into a standard job role, but thinking imaginatively about how you can use the talents and skills of that disabled employee within your organisation. Now that could affect really core terms and conditions of employment, your supervision, your location of work, you know, who manages you, how they manage you, all those sorts of issues. Why is this not a formal process? And this is some of the feedback that I have actually given in my evidence back to the Cabinet Office when they've asked for evidence on equality law, that I think that, you know, we need to formalise this so that both employees and employers understand the seriousness of the reasonable adjustment process. I think, you know, the law is good and it's useful, but it's not being implemented. If you can't access and operationalise the law, it's a pointless law. You know, there's no point in it existing.
Thank you, Debbie. Really clear instructions there. And I think that point around access to justice, but also access to support, as you say, to actually at those early stages before it's anywhere near a dispute, actually have the right support for both employers and workers to redesign the job as is needed, and to have some kind of formalized process around that makes so much sense. And on your point about case studies for how this can be done well in an employment setting, we do have some of those, I'm pleased to say, as part of the study. And when the report is published, we'll be drawing attention to some of those positive examples of good practice where employers are really implementing changes in a good way. We are drawing the session to a close now. I'd like to thank everybody involved for their participation and their active involvement, particularly our panelists, who I think have really brought this conversation to life for us. But I want to say a big thanks and well done to Paula Holland as well for leading the study, and for the wider project team, some of whom are in the call today, others aren't. So thank you everyone for that. Also to our brilliant sign language interpreters as well, who have been active throughout the session, Sally and Najal. So thank you very much for participating, and for Work Foundation colleagues who are behind the scenes dealing with the tech, etc. So thanks very much, everyone. We will be sharing notes from the meeting with some of those involved, and also be publishing the report soon. So please do look out for that. There will be a recording as well shared.
And thank you, Alice, for your excellent chairing. We finished on time.
Bang on time. All right, thanks everyone. Let's have good afternoons. I hope the results of the vote aren't too depressing, although I worry that they might be. But yes, have good afternoons, everyone. Bye-bye.